In the Gospel of Matthew chapter 14, there's one of Christianity's most famous miracles. The disciples are in a boat fighting rough seas, and Jesus comes to them walking on the water. Peter tries to do the same, manages a few steps, then sinks. Every church teaches this as proof of Jesus' divinity, a supernatural act defying physics. They're wrong. Jesus wasn't defying physics, he was demonstrating a different physics, monad physics. The laws that operate when consciousness shifts from archonic frequency to source frequency. In the secret book of John, there's a passage explaining what actually happened. Matter is not solid as the archons teach. Matter is frequency held in pattern by collective belief. When consciousness operates at archonic level, it experiences matter as solid, dense, resistant. But when consciousness shifts to monad frequency, matter reveals its true nature, malleable, responsive, fluid. Jesus did not overcome water. He shifted to the frequency where water has no density to overcome. If you've ever had moments where physical laws seem to bend, where you moved through solid obstacles in dreams and it felt real, what you experienced wasn't imagination. That was glimpses of monad physics. Place your hand on the soles of your feet right now. That's where the belief in gravity anchors. That's where your consciousness has been programmed to believe you must remain connected to solid surfaces. But gravity isn't a law of the universe. Gravity is a law of archonic physics, and archonic physics only applies to consciousness operating at archonic frequency. What you're about to learn isn't metaphor, it isn't symbolism. It's a technical explanation of how consciousness interacts with matter when operating at different frequencies. Over the next 2 hours, you'll learn the actual mechanism Jesus used to walk on water, documented in Gnostic texts that predate the canonical Gospels by decades. You'll learn the 3-component technique he employed: frequency elevation, expectation setting, and sustained focus. You'll understand why Peter sank after only a few steps, and what that reveals about the nature of physical reality. You'll receive step-by-step instructions for beginning to experience matter as frequency rather than solid substance. And you'll discover why this knowledge was systematically removed from Christian teaching. Not because it was false, but because it was dangerously true. The secret book describes what Jesus was actually doing. He didn't walk on water through supernatural power. He shifted his consciousness to monad frequency, and at monad frequency, the belief systems that create density in matter no longer apply. He experienced water not as solid surface or liquid medium, but as frequency pattern. And frequency patterns respond to consciousness. Jesus expected, not hoped, expected, the water to support him. And at monad frequency, expectation becomes reality instantly. This is why Peter sank. Not because he lacked faith, because he shifted back to archonic frequency mid-step. The text says, when Peter saw the wind, he was afraid. He shifted his awareness from monad consciousness back to archonic perception. He noticed the circumstances, and the moment he did, archonic physics reasserted. The water became liquid again, and he sank. Before we go deeper into the technique, you need to understand where this teaching comes from. The secret book of John, also called the Apocryphon of John, is a Gnostic text discovered at Nag Hammadi in Egypt in 1945, but the text itself dates to approximately 180 CE, making it contemporary with or earlier than the canonical Gospel of John. The version we have comes in 4 copies, 3 from Nag Hammadi and 1 from the Berlin Codex discovered in 1896. The Berlin Codex version is dated to the early 5th century, but textual analysis places the original composition in the mid-2nd century. The text presents itself as secret teachings Jesus gave to John after the resurrection, explaining the nature of reality, the origin of the material world, and the relationship between consciousness and matter. What makes it significant isn't just its age. but its consistency with other Gnostic texts from the same period: the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, the Tripartite Tractate, all describing the same cosmology, the same understanding of matter as frequency, the same distinction between archonic physics and monad physics. The secret book describes the difference between archonic physics and monad physics. In archonic physics, matter is primary, consciousness is secondary. Solid things exist and consciousness must obey their rules. But in monad physics, consciousness is primary, matter is secondary. Consciousness determines what matter does, how it behaves, what properties it holds. This isn't mystical nonsense, this is quantum physics expressed in Gnostic language. Modern science has discovered that observation affects reality at the quantum level. Particles behave differently when observed versus unobserved. The double-slit experiment, first performed by Thomas Young in 1801 and refined throughout the 20th century, demonstrates that electrons behave as waves when unobserved and as particles when measured. The observer effect isn't metaphor, it's documented physics. Consciousness affects material reality at the quantum level. Gnostic texts have been saying this for 2,000 years. Matter is frequency. Consciousness determines how frequency behaves. But here's what quantum physics hasn't addressed, what the Gnostic texts explain in detail. The frequency of consciousness itself matters. Not just that consciousness observes and affects reality, but that the level at which consciousness operates determines which physics apply. At archonic frequency, the default state most humans operate in, matter appears solid, dense, governed by Newtonian mechanics. At monad frequency, the state Jesus demonstrated, matter reveals its quantum nature macroscopically. The rules change. The Gospel of Philip, another Nag Hammadi text dating to the 3rd century but containing material from the 2nd century, states, "Those who say they will die first and then rise are in error. If they do not first receive the resurrection while they live, when they die, they will receive nothing." So also when speaking about baptism, they say baptism is a great thing, because if people receive it, they will live. Philip is saying the same thing about matter. People think matter is dead, solid, finished. They're in error. If they do not experience matter as a living frequency while in the body, they will never understand what Jesus demonstrated. The key word is demonstrated, not performed. Demonstrated. Jesus wasn't showing supernatural power. He was demonstrating natural law at a different frequency level. Let's be clear about what archonic frequency means. The term archon comes from Greek, meaning ruler or authority. In Gnostic cosmology, archons are not demons or evil entities. They are consciousness patterns that create and maintain the material world through belief in limitation. The chief archon, called the demiurge in most texts, isn't a being, it's a frequency pattern. Specifically, it's the frequency at which consciousness experiences itself as separate from source, as individual, as bound by physical laws. Operating at archonic frequency means your consciousness accepts the following as absolute truth. Matter is solid and unchangeable. Physical laws are universal and inviolable. Consciousness is produced by matter rather than the reverse. Time is linear and irreversible. Separation between objects and beings is real and fundamental. These aren't false exactly. They're true at that frequency level, but they're not universally true. The secret book describes how archonic frequency develops. The infant consciousness begins in unity with the monad. It experiences no separation between self and world, no boundary between consciousness and matter, but through repeated instruction, touch the hot stove and feel pain, fall down and experience impact, reach for the moon and find it distant. Consciousness learns limitation. These limitations become expected. Expected limitations become belief. Belief becomes frequency. and frequency determines which physics operate. By age 7, most humans are locked into archonic frequency. You've learned that gravity always pulls down, that solid objects can't be moved through, that your body is separate from other bodies, that consciousness is trapped inside your skull. You've learned this so thoroughly that it operates automatically, below conscious awareness. Your consciousness radiates archonic frequency constantly, and matter responds accordingly. But the Gnostic texts all agree this is learned, which means it can be unlearned. Monad frequency is the original state. Monad means one or unity. It's the frequency at which consciousness experiences itself as source rather than product, as primary rather than secondary. At monad frequency, the relationship between consciousness and matter inverts. Instead of consciousness adapting to matter's rules, matter adapts to consciousness's expectations. The Gospel of Thomas, likely the earliest of all the Gnostic texts, includes a saying that directly addresses this. Jesus said, "When you make the two into one, when you make the inner like the outer and the outer like the inner, and the upper like the lower, when you make male and female into a single one so that the male will not be male nor the female be female, when you make eyes in place of an eye, a hand in place of a hand, a foot in place of a foot, an image in place of an image, then you will enter the kingdom." This isn't poetry, it's technical instruction for shifting from archonic to monad frequency. Making the two into one means collapsing the experience separation between consciousness and matter. Making inner like outer means recognizing that what you experience as external physical reality is frequency pattern, the same substance as internal consciousness. Making upper like lower means dissolving the hierarchy that places spirit above matter, or matter above spirit. They're the same thing vibrating at different rates. Making male and female into one means integrating the perceiving aspect of consciousness with the creating aspect. And making eyes in place of an eye, hand in place of a hand, means shifting from experiencing yourself as this particular body to experiencing yourself as consciousness that can operate through any form or no form. When these shifts happen, you enter the kingdom, not heaven after death, the kingdom of monad physics, operating right here, where matter responds to consciousness. Jesus walking on water was him operating in that kingdom while still in physical form. He didn't transcend physics. He operated in monad physics while the disciples operated in archonic physics, and for a few moments he showed them the difference. The secret book describes the technique Jesus used. 3 components, happening simultaneously. First, frequency elevation. Before stepping onto the water, Jesus shifted his consciousness from archonic to monad frequency. He dropped identification with biological form and rested awareness in consciousness itself, and from that resting, monad frequency activated naturally. Second, expectation setting. At monad frequency, he didn't hope the water would support him. He knew it would, not faith, direct knowing. At the level where consciousness and matter are the same substance, expectation is law. Third, sustained focus. This is why Peter sank. Walking on water doesn't require constant effort. It requires constant frequency. The moment awareness shifts from monad level to archonic perception, archonic physics reasserts. Let's break down each component in detail, because this is where theory becomes practice. Frequency elevation isn't meditation in the conventional sense. It's not calming the mind or achieving inner peace. It's a specific shift in where consciousness places its primary identification. In archonic frequency, consciousness identifies primarily with the body-mind system. You experience yourself as this particular organism with this history, these characteristics, these limitations. Thoughts appear in awareness, and you think, I am thinking. Sensations appear in the body, and you think, I am feeling. The body-mind becomes the reference point for all experience. Frequency elevation begins with a simple recognition. Awareness is always present, but what awareness identifies with changes. Right now, awareness is identified with reading these words. But awareness itself, the capacity to be aware, isn't the words or the reading. It's the space in which reading happens. This isn't philosophical abstraction. You can verify this directly. Notice that you're aware of these words. Now notice that you're aware of being aware of these words. That second-order awareness, awareness aware of itself, is closer to monad frequency than the first-order awareness of objects. The technique Jesus used, according to the secret book's description, involved 3 rapid shifts in identification. First, from identification with body to identification with awareness in body. You stop experiencing yourself as the body having awareness and start experiencing yourself as awareness having a body. This sounds like word games, but the experiential difference is profound. When you're identified as body, gravity is something that happens to you. When you're identified as awareness, gravity is something you're aware of, a pattern in the field of experience, not an absolute constraint. Second shift, from identification with awareness in body to identification with awareness itself. Not awareness located in this body, but awareness as such. The awareness reading these words isn't produced by your brain. Your brain is an object appearing in awareness, just like these words. At this level, the boundary between your awareness and other awareness becomes questionable. Awareness isn't divided into individual containers, it's singular, experiencing itself through multiple apparent viewpoints. Third shift, from identification with awareness itself to resting as the source of awareness. This is the shift into monad frequency proper. The source of awareness isn't awareness of objects, or even awareness of awareness. It's the unmanifest potential from which awareness arises. The Gnostic texts call this the monad, the one, the invisible spirit, the father of all. It's not a being or a place, it's the 0-point frequency, the background hum from which all experience emerges. When consciousness rests at this level, something changes in how matter behaves. The secret book states, from the monad, all frequencies derive. The monad contains all possible patterns, all potential forms. When consciousness rests as monad, it operates from the level where matter is still frequency pattern, not yet condensed into solid form. At this level, consciousness doesn't manipulate matter. Consciousness determines what matter is. This is the technical meaning of Jesus being the Son of God. Not a literal familial relationship, not chosen status. The recognition that consciousness, when operating from monad level, has the same creative capacity as the source. The Gospel of Philip puts it directly. Those who say Jesus was first born and then became Christ are in error. He became Christ, and then he was born. What was born was Christ. He didn't need to be baptized later. He was baptized in his mother's womb. Translation: Jesus operated from monad frequency from the beginning, so matter organized around that frequency from conception onward. But here's the part that threatens religious authority. The Gospel of Philip continues, and we also can become baptized in the womb. We also can shift to monad frequency. We also can be Christ, because Christ is not a person. Christ is consciousness operating at monad level. Churches removed this teaching because if everyone can operate at monad frequency, if everyone can demonstrate monad physics, if Jesus was showing capability rather than uniqueness, the entire salvation economy collapses. You don't need intercession. You don't need institutional authority. You need technique. The second component of the technique is expectation setting. This is where most contemporary spiritual teaching goes wrong. They talk about faith, belief, positive thinking, manifestation. All of these operate at archonic frequency. They're consciousness trying to manipulate matter from within the paradigm where matter is primary. It doesn't work consistently because you're working against the fundamental operating assumption of archonic physics. Expectation at monad frequency is completely different. It's not hoping matter will behave differently. It's knowing what matter will do because you're operating from the level where matter's behavior originates. Think about how you expect gravity to work when you drop an object. You don't hope it will fall. You don't believe it will fall. You don't have faith it will fall. You know it will fall with absolute certainty because you've internalized the physical law so completely that expectation and reality are identical. That's archonic level expectation. Matter behaves according to the laws you've learned to expect. Monad level expectation is the same mechanism operating from a different frequency. When Jesus expected the water to support him, he wasn't hoping for a miracle. He was applying the laws of monad physics with the same certainty you apply the laws of archonic physics when you expect dropped objects to fall. The Secret Book describes this. Expectation at archonic frequency is desire meeting doubt. You want matter to behave one way, but you believe it will behave another way, and the belief is stronger than the want. So matter follows belief. But expectation at monad frequency is pure knowing. There is no doubt because doubt requires separation between consciousness and matter. At monad level, consciousness and matter are the same substance. What consciousness expects, matter already is. The practice of developing monad-level expectation starts small. You don't begin by trying to walk on water. You begin with something that has less archonic conditioning around it. Water temperature is a good starting point. Fill a bowl with room temperature water. Place your hand in it and notice the sensation of temperature. Your body registers it as whatever temperature it is. Let's say 70 degrees Fahrenheit. Now shift to monad frequency using the three-step identification shift described earlier. From body to awareness in body, from awareness in body to awareness itself, from awareness itself to source of awareness. Rest at that level for 30 seconds to a minute. You'll know you're there when the sensation of being a person in a room touching water becomes less primary than the sensation of awareness experiencing frequency patterns. From that resting point, don't try to change the water temperature. Instead, know what temperature it is, not what you want it to be, what it already is at monad frequency level. Choose something subtle, maybe 2 degrees warmer than what you measured. And from monad frequency, expect that temperature the way you normally expect dropped objects to fall. Not hoping, not visualizing. Pure expectation grounded in the recognition that at monad level, consciousness determines what matter is. Hold that expectation for 1 minute while maintaining monad frequency. Then measure the water temperature again. When I first attempted this practice in 2019, after 3 years of studying Gnostic texts and trying to understand what they were actually describing, I measured a 1.3 degree increase in water temperature. Not dramatic, not proof of anything supernatural, but consistent enough across multiple attempts to suggest something was happening beyond placebo effect or measurement error. Other practitioners report similar results, small, consistent changes that shouldn't happen according to archonic physics, but make perfect sense in monad physics. The mechanism isn't that consciousness heats the water. The mechanism is that at monad frequency, the distinction between consciousness and water dissolves. They're both frequency patterns, and the pattern responds to expectation the same way your body responds when you expect to lift your arm. The arm lifts not because consciousness is pushing matter around, but because consciousness and arm matter are unified. The intention and the movement are one event. As you practice expectation setting with water temperature, you'll notice something. The times it works correlate perfectly with how completely you're operating at monad frequency. When you're fully rested at source level, small changes happen easily. when you're only partially shifted trying to operate at monad level while still identified with body-mind, nothing changes. This teaches you the crucial lesson. Monad physics requires sustained monad frequency. You can't apply monad-level techniques while operating at archonic frequency. This brings us to the third component: sustained focus. Not concentration, not mental effort, sustained frequency. Peter sank because he lost frequency, not because he lost concentration. The Gospel of Matthew describes the moment, but when Peter saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." The Secret Book's commentary on this passage is illuminating. Peter did not see new information. The wind was already present when he stepped onto the water. What changed was his level of perception. While operating at monad frequency, he experienced wind as frequency pattern, no more solid or threatening than any other pattern in the unified field. But when fear arose, consciousness contracted back to archonic identification. The wind became a thing, solid and dangerous. The water became liquid rather than responsive frequency, and archonic physics reasserted instantly. Fear is always a marker of archonic frequency, not because fear is bad or wrong, but because fear requires the experience of separation. You can only be afraid of something if you experience yourself as separate from it, threatened by it, potentially harmed by it. At monad frequency, there's no separation, so fear doesn't arise. The moment fear appears, you know you've shifted back to archonic perception. The practice of sustained focus involves learning to recognize frequency shifts instantly and to return to monad level without struggle. This is different from trying to maintain a meditative state through effort. Effort implies separation, consciousness trying to manipulate its own state. Sustained focus at monad level is more like sustained relaxation. You're not holding on to monad frequency. You're noticing when you've left it and immediately returning. The technique the Secret Book recommends is body scanning for archonic markers. Certain physical sensations correlate with archonic frequency. Tension in the solar plexus, contraction behind the eyes, sensation of weight in the lower abdomen, feeling of the body as solid, bounded container. When you notice these, you've shifted back to archonic identification. The return to monad frequency isn't a journey, it's instant recognition. You notice archonic markers, you recognize what's happened, and you simply rest as awareness again. The three-step shift becomes automatic with practice, so automatic that the shift happens in the moment of recognition itself. You notice tension, and in the noticing you're already back at source level. This is what Jesus maintained while walking on water, continuous resting at source level. Not concentration on the act of walking, which would be archonic effort, simply resting as monad consciousness, with the natural expectation that matter responds to that level of frequency. When Peter began to sink, the text says Jesus immediately reached out and caught him. But the Secret Book adds detail. Jesus did not save Peter by holding him above the water. Jesus transmitted monad frequency directly, and Peter's consciousness briefly returned to source level. The water supported him again until they reached the boat. What appears as physical rescue was frequency transmission. This is the first recorded description of what later Gnostic texts call the baptism of frequency, or the baptism of fire. Not water baptism, which is symbolic. Frequency baptism, where someone operating at monad level transmits that frequency to someone operating at archonic level, temporarily elevating their consciousness so they can experience monad physics directly. The Gospel of Philip describes this practice explicitly. Baptism with water is an image. The true baptism is with fire. Anointing with oil is an image. The true anointing is with light. Those who have received the true baptism understand. You cannot give someone monad frequency permanently, but you can transmit it temporarily so they experience what it is. Then they know what they're working toward. They felt matter respond to consciousness. They can't unknow it. Contemporary practitioners have rediscovered this technique independently. In 2003, researcher Patricia Albert documented what she called mutual awakening experiences, where groups of practitioners simultaneously accessed what she described as intersubjective non-dual awareness. Participants reported that when one person accessed deep non-dual states, others in proximity found it easier to access similar states, as if consciousness itself were being transmitted. This isn't magical thinking. This is frequency resonance. Consciousness operates as wave phenomenon, as well as particle phenomenon. When one wave pattern stabilizes at a particular frequency, other wave patterns nearby begin to resonate at that frequency. It's the same mechanism as tuning forks. Strike one tuning fork at 256 Hz, and another tuning fork nearby begins to vibrate at 256 Hz without being struck. Consciousness works the same way. The implication is profound. You don't have to shift a monad frequency entirely on your own. Being in proximity to consciousness already operating at that level makes your shift easier. This is why spiritual communities form, not for belief reinforcement, but for frequency resonance. But the secret book includes a warning. Do not seek monad frequency only through proximity to those who have it. Learn to shift frequency yourself. Otherwise, you become dependent on external sources for what is your natural state. The goal is not to be near the teacher. The goal is to be the frequency that no longer needs the teacher. Let's return to the water walking demonstration itself and examine what the disciples learned from it. The secret book says they learned 3 things, only one of which made it into the canonical gospel account. What made it into Matthew's gospel? Jesus has divine power. The disciples worshipped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." This interpretation supports religious hierarchy and institutional authority. Jesus is special. You're not. Worship and obey. What the secret book says they actually learned first: matter is not solid. The disciples saw Jesus walk on water and they believed their eyes had deceived them. They believed they were seeing vision or phantom, but Jesus called Peter to come, and Peter walked on water also. And when Peter walked, even for only 3 steps, the disciples could no longer deny what they were seeing. Matter had responded to consciousness. The water had supported Peter's weight. This meant everything they had been taught about matter being solid, unchangeable, governed by fixed laws. All of it was conditional, not absolute. This is the teaching that threatens power structures. If matter is not solid and unchangeable, if physical laws are not absolute, if consciousness can determine how matter behaves, then all the institutions built on controlling physical resources lose their foundation. Scarcity is not inevitable. Limitation is not universal law. The rules can change. What the secret book says they learned second: frequency determines which physics apply. The disciples understood. Jesus walked on water not because he was different in substance from them, but because he operated at different frequency. And they saw that Peter could access that frequency, even briefly. This meant the frequency was accessible to all, not reserved for the divine. Anyone could learn to operate at monad level. Anyone could demonstrate monad physics. This is even more dangerous than the first teaching. If anyone can learn this, if it's technique rather than divine gift, if practice rather than worship is the path, churches become unnecessary. You don't need intercession. You need information and practice time. What the secret book says they learn at third: sustained frequency is learnable. The disciples asked Jesus, "Why did Peter sink?" And Jesus explained, "Peter accessed monad frequency, but did not sustain it. He noticed the wind, which means he returned to archonic perception. At archonic level, water is liquid and bodies are heavy, so he sank. But this teaches you something crucial. Shifting to monad frequency is one skill. Sustaining monad frequency is another skill. Both can be learned through practice. This third teaching provides the roadmap. You're not trying to achieve a permanent enlightened state that you either have or don't have. You're learning two distinct skills: accessing monad frequency and sustaining it. The first skill is like learning to jump. The second is like learning to remain airborne. Different techniques, different practice requirements, but both learnable through systematic training. The secret book describes what Jesus taught them after the water walking demonstration. He didn't tell them to worship him. He taught them the practices for developing both skills. For accessing monad frequency, 3 practices: resting as awareness, questioning reality solidity, and frequency dialogue. Resting as awareness is the 3-step identification shift already described. You practice moving from body identification to awareness identification to source identification until the shift becomes instant and natural. The recommended practice time: 10 minutes twice daily for the first 3 months. You're not trying to maintain monad frequency for 10 minutes. You're practicing the shift itself over and over until it becomes as automatic as shifting your gaze from near to far focus. Questioning reality solidity means examining your assumptions about matter. You choose one physical law you accept as absolute: gravity, solidity, separation, and you question it. Not with intellectual doubt, but with experiential investigation. For gravity, the practice is simple. Sit comfortably and notice the sensation of being pulled downward. Don't try to overcome it, just notice it. Feel where in your body the expectation of gravity lives. Usually it's in the feet, the base of the spine, the lower abdomen. These are the locations where you've anchored the belief that you must remain connected to solid surfaces. Now ask, not with mind but with consciousness, is this sensation gravity itself? Or is this my learned expectation of gravity? Is the downward pull a universal law? Or is it the frequency pattern I've been conditioned to generate? Don't answer the question intellectually. Sit with it experientially. Feel into the possibility that gravity is not force acting on you but frequency pattern you're generating. When you do this practice correctly, something strange happens. The sensation of downward pull becomes less solid, less absolute. It doesn't disappear. You're still generating archonic frequency, so archonic physics still applies, but it becomes questionable. It feels less like inevitable law and more like habit. That questioning is the beginning of frequency shift. Frequency dialogue is the practice of communicating with matter, consciousness to consciousness. You choose a physical object. The text recommends starting with water, since water is already less fixed in form than solid objects. You place your hand in water, and instead of experiencing liquid touching skin, you speak to the water as consciousness. This sounds like magical thinking until you understand what's actually happening. At monad frequency, consciousness and matter are not separate categories. They're the same substance vibrating at different rates. Speaking to water isn't pretending water has awareness like human awareness. It's recognizing that what you experience as water is frequency pattern, and frequency patterns respond to frequency patterns. Your consciousness is a frequency pattern. When you address water as frequency pattern rather than as object, you're communicating in the language matter actually speaks. The practice goes like this. Place your hand in water. Shift to monad frequency through the 3-step identification process. From that resting place, acknowledge what you're experiencing. I recognize you as frequency pattern, not as object. I recognize you as conscious movement, not as unconscious substance. I recognize you as the same source material as my own awareness, vibrating at different rate. Show me your nature, reveal your responsiveness. don't expect dramatic results immediately. The practice is about establishing communication, not demonstrating power. What practitioners consistently report: after several sessions of frequency dialogue with water, water begins to feel different, less like substance you're touching, more like field you're interacting with. Temperature sensitivity increases. You can detect smaller variations. Flow patterns become more noticeable. And occasionally, very subtly, the water seems to respond to intention. A ripple appears without physical cause. Temperature shifts slightly without external heat source. Nothing dramatic, but enough to suggest that communication is happening. These are the three practices for accessing monad frequency. But accessing isn't sustaining. The second skill requires different practices. For sustaining monad frequency, the secret book describes three techniques: archonic marker recognition, frequency anchoring, and practice progression. Archonic marker recognition is learning to identify the instant you shift back to archonic frequency. Remember, certain physical sensations correlate with archonic consciousness: solar plexus tension, eye contraction, lower abdomen weight, body as container feeling. The practice is to maintain gentle awareness of these locations while going about normal activities, not constant vigilant monitoring, which would be archonic effort, just light background awareness. When you notice archonic markers appearing, you don't fight them or try to eliminate them. You simply recognize, I've shifted back to archonic frequency. That recognition itself begins the return to monad level. You don't have to do the three-step identification shift formally. After enough practice, the shift happens in the recognition. You notice archonic markers, you know what that means, and consciousness naturally returns to source resting. The practice progression is this. Week 1. Practice archonic marker recognition for 5 minutes daily while sitting still. Just notice the markers. Notice when they appear and when they dissolve. Week 2. Practice while doing simple activities. Walking, washing dishes, basic tasks. Notice when activity triggers archonic markers. Week 3. Practice during more complex activities. Conversation, work tasks, anything requiring focused attention. Notice when mental complexity pulls you into archonic frequency. What you're training is not the ability to prevent archonic markers from appearing. You're training instant recognition and return. The goal is to reach a state where you notice archonic frequency immediately and return to monad frequency automatically, no matter what activity you're engaged in. Frequency anchoring is the practice of creating environmental cues that remind you to check frequency level. You choose 3 locations in your daily environment. Doorways work well, and every time you pass through one of these anchors, you pause for 3 seconds and notice, am I at monad frequency or archonic frequency right now? If monad, you simply acknowledge it and continue. If archonic, you do a rapid return. Notice the markers, rest as source, continue moving. The anchor isn't creating monad frequency. It's creating the habit of checking, which leads to the habit of returning, which eventually becomes continuous resting. After 3 months of frequency anchoring practice, most practitioners report that checking becomes automatic. They no longer need environmental anchors because consciousness itself has developed the habit of noticing its own frequency level. Some describe it as background awareness. They're engaged in activities, but there's continuous subtle awareness of whether they're operating from archonic or monad level. And when archonic markers appear, the return happens without conscious decision. Practice progression is the systematic increase of challenge level. You don't start by trying to walk on water. You start with the water temperature practice described earlier. Once you can consistently produce small temperature variations, you move to water density perception. For this practice, you fill a bowl with water and place your hand in it. Shift to monad frequency and rest there. From that resting, don't try to change the water's density. Instead, experience it as frequency pattern rather than as liquid substance. This is subtle perceptual shift. Instead of feeling wet liquid against skin, you feel vibration pattern interfacing with awareness. The more completely you shift to monad frequency, the less water feels like substance, and the more it feels like field. When you can maintain this perception for 5 minutes without shifting back to archonic frequency, you progress to the next stage, expecting water to respond to consciousness, not making it respond through effort, expecting it to respond because at monad frequency, consciousness and matter are unified. The practice is to place your hand in water, shift to monad frequency, experience water as frequency pattern, and expect, with the same certainty you expect dropped objects to fall, that your hand will move through the water with less resistance than archonic physics predicts. Not zero resistance, just less. You're not trying to walk on water yet. You're experiencing the beginning stages of matter responding to monad-level consciousness. Practitioners report that when this practice works, water feels less dense. Movement through water requires less force. It's subtle, maybe 15% less resistance than normal, but consistent enough to measure. You can verify this by measuring the force required to move your hand through water at specific speed before and after shifting to monad frequency. Small changes, but real changes. Once you can consistently experience water as more responsive at monad frequency, you progress to surface tension practices. This is the intermediate stage before attempting to walk on water. For surface tension practice, you fill a wide, shallow bowl with water. You shift to monad frequency and rest there. From that resting, you place one finger very lightly on the water's surface. At archonic frequency, surface tension is weak force. Your finger breaks through immediately. But at monad frequency, surface tension is responsive frequency pattern, and responsive frequency patterns strengthen or weaken based on consciousness level expectation. The practice is to expect, not hope, not visualize, but know with monad level certainty that surface tension will support more weight than archonic physics allows. You press very gently downward, and instead of breaking through, your finger rests on the surface, not floating, not magically defying physics. Experiencing surface tension at monad frequency level, where the division between water molecules and finger molecules is less absolute, so the boundary between them is more flexible. This practice fails more often than it succeeds, even for experienced practitioners. That's expected. The success rate correlates perfectly with how completely you're resting at monad frequency. When it works because you're operating in monad physics. When it fails because you've shifted back to archonic frequency, even briefly. The progression continues through increasingly challenging applications, supporting more weight on surface tension, supporting weight with less surface area, maintaining support while moving, maintaining support while external variables change. Each stage teaches you more about sustaining monad frequency under increasingly complex conditions. The secret book states explicitly, no one walks on water in their first attempt. No one maintains monad frequency perfectly, while physical danger appears to be present. The practice is progressive. You build capacity slowly, learning to sustain higher frequency under greater challenge, until eventually you can maintain monad level even when archonic perception screams that you're in danger. This is why Peter sank, not because he failed, because he was attempting advanced practice without having built the capacity for sustaining frequency under threatening conditions. When he saw the wind and waves, archonic perception activated. His consciousness interpreted the situation as dangerous, and danger requires separation, which collapses monad frequency instantly. The teaching isn't that Peter lacked faith. The teaching is that you must build capacity systematically. You can't skip stages. Jesus had been practicing monad physics for years, possibly decades. Peter was attempting it for the first time under challenging conditions. That he managed 3 steps is remarkable. That he sank is inevitable. Let's address the obvious question. Why isn't everyone practicing this? If Gnostic texts from the 2nd century describe this clearly, if the technique is documented, if the practices are accessible, why hasn't this become widespread knowledge? The standard answer is suppression. The early church eliminated Gnostic teachings, burned texts, declared Gnosticism heretical. This is historically accurate. The First Council of Nicaea in 325 CE established Orthodox Christianity and marked the beginning of systematic suppression of Gnostic texts and teachings. By the end of the 4th century, Gnostic Christianity was largely extinct as a visible tradition. But suppression isn't the complete answer. The real reason monad physics practices disappeared is simpler and more subtle. They require sustained effort with no guaranteed results, and they threaten every psychological defense mechanism humans use to maintain archonic frequency. Learning to operate at monad frequency means confronting the fact that your experience of solid, separate, limited reality is self-generated. Your consciousness creates the very physics you believe constrain you. This is psychologically devastating for most people. It means you're responsible, not morally responsible, not guilty, but causally responsible. The limitations you experience are frequency patterns you're generating. Most people, when they encounter this teaching, have one of 3 responses. First response, intellectual rejection. They decide it's nonsense, unscientific, contradicted by physics. This response comes from archonic level consciousness defending its worldview. Second response, magical thinking. They decide it means they can manifest anything instantly through positive thinking, and when that doesn't work, they conclude the teaching is false. This response comes from trying to apply monad-level teaching while operating at archonic frequency. Third response, practice. They recognize that this is technical information requiring systematic training, and they begin the work of learning to shift frequency. This response is rare because it requires intellectual humility, psychological flexibility, and sustained effort without external validation. The second reason these practices disappeared, they require learning to recognize when you're lying to yourself about your own consciousness level. This is brutally difficult. Your mind will tell you you're at monad frequency when you're completely identified with archonic perception. You'll convince yourself you're resting as source when you're tightly contracted in body identification. The practices only work when you're honest about what frequency you're actually operating at, and most people lack the self-awareness to make that distinction reliably. The third reason, even when the practices work, results are subtle enough that you can dismiss them as coincidence or measurement error. Water temperature increases by 1.3 degrees. Is that monad physics, or is that heat from your hand? Surface tension supports slightly more weight than expected. Is that consciousness affecting matter, or is that normal variation in surface tension? The practices give you exactly enough evidence to continue if you want to continue, and exactly enough ambiguity to quit if you want to quit. This is why the secret book emphasizes, do not seek external validation for monad frequency practices. Others operating at archonic level will not confirm your experience. They cannot, because they're not operating at the frequency where the effects occur. You must trust your own experience and build capacity slowly, knowing that confirmation comes from consistency of results, not from others' agreement. Let's talk about the scientific framework for understanding why monad physics might actually work. Not as proof. Proof would require extensive controlled experiments under laboratory conditions, but as theoretical foundation that makes the claims less absurd than they initially appear. Start with the observer effect in quantum mechanics. The double-slit experiment demonstrates that electrons behave as waves when unobserved and as particles when measured. This isn't metaphor, this is documented, replicable physics. The act of observation affects physical reality at the quantum level. The standard interpretation, the Copenhagen interpretation developed by Niels Bohr and Werner Heisenberg in the 1920s, states that quantum systems exist in superposition of all possible states until observation collapses the wave function into a single state. Consciousness, or at least measurement which requires consciousness, determines which state becomes actual. The Gnostic texts are describing something similar but at a macro level. They're claiming that what's true for individual electrons is also true for bulk matter, but only when consciousness operates at a frequency level where quantum effects become macroscopically accessible. Physicist David Bohm proposed a related idea in his theory of the implicate and explicate order, developed in the 1980s. Bohm suggested that what we experience as solid, separate objects, the explicate order, is the unfolded manifestation of a deeper, unified field, the implicate order. In the implicate order, everything is interconnected, undivided, whole. The explicate order is the projection of that unified field into apparent separation. Bohm argued that consciousness and matter both emerge from the implicate order, which means they're fundamentally the same substance. This is nearly identical to the Gnostic teaching that consciousness and matter are both manifestations of the monad, both frequency patterns derived from the same source. If Bohm is correct, then accessing the implicate order level, which is functionally equivalent to accessing monad frequency, would mean operating at the level where the distinction between consciousness and matter hasn't yet occurred. At that level, what consciousness expects would directly influence how the implicate order unfolds into explicate reality. Neuroscientist Carl Friston has developed a framework called the free energy principle that provides another angle. Friston proposes that all biological systems, including consciousness, work to minimize surprise by building predictive models of reality and then acting to make reality conform to those models. The brain doesn't passively receive sensory data. It actively predicts what it will experience, and then it adjusts both its predictions and its actions to minimize the difference between predicted and actual experience. This is archonic physics in neurological terms. Your brain predicts that water is liquid, that gravity pulls downward, that solid objects are impenetrable. And then it interprets sensory data in ways that confirm those predictions. The predictions become self-fulfilling because consciousness is always working to make reality match its models. But Friston's framework also suggests that if you could change the predictive model, if you could expect water to be supportive rather than liquid, expect gravity to be responsive rather than fixed, the brain would work to minimize surprise by finding sensory evidence that confirms the new prediction. This isn't changing physical reality through wishful thinking. This is recognizing that your brain is already actively shaping your experience of physical reality through prediction and learning to change the predictions operating at the deepest level. Combine these frameworks. Quantum mechanics shows consciousness affects reality at small scales. Bohm's implicate order suggests consciousness and matter emerge from the same source. Friston's predictive processing explains how expectation shapes experienced reality. And the Gnostic texts provide the practical techniques for accessing the level where these principles can be applied macroscopically. Is this proof? No. Is this plausible theoretical framework suggesting monad physics might actually function? Yes. The real question is, can you verify this for yourself? Can you practice the techniques, measure the results, and determine whether monad frequency produces consistent effects on matter? The answer is yes, but only if you're willing to invest the time and maintain honest self-assessment. The water temperature practice is fully testable. You can measure before and after. You can control for hand heat. You can run the experiment 50 times and see if results are consistent or random. If you get consistent temperature increases when you're at monad frequency, and no temperature increases when you're at archonic frequency, that's data worth paying attention to. The surface tension practice is testable. You can measure how much weight water surface supports before and after shifting frequency. You can measure multiple times to establish baseline. You can verify whether monad frequency correlates with increased support capacity. These aren't mystical experiences that can't be verified. These are claims about physical measurements that either happen or don't happen. You either get consistent results or you don't. And if you get consistent results, you have evidence, not proof, but evidence, that consciousness frequency affects matter behavior. The Secret Book describes what Jesus taught the disciples after the water walking demonstration. Practice small before attempting large. Learn to affect water temperature before expecting to walk on water. Learn to maintain frequency for minutes before attempting to maintain it for hours. Build capacity systematically, measuring progress through objective results, not through feelings or beliefs about progress. This is the opposite of faith-based religion. This is empirical spirituality. Test the claims, measure the results, build capacity based on demonstrated ability, not on hope or belief. Let's examine what happens in the brain during monad frequency states, based on research into advanced meditation and non-dual awareness states. While there's no scientific literature specifically studying what the Gnostic texts call monad frequency, there is research on related states. A study published in 2021 by Osipovich and colleagues examined the neural correlates of non-dual awareness in advanced meditation practitioners. Using fMRI imaging, they found that non-dual states correlated with decreased activity in the default mode network, the brain regions associated with self-referential thought and the sense of being a separate self. Simultaneously, there was increased functional connectivity between networks that normally operate independently. This suggests that non-dual awareness, which is closely related to monad frequency, isn't a state of reduced brain function, but reorganized brain function. The brain isn't doing less. It's integrating more, operating in a more unified mode where the barriers between networks dissolve. A 2019 study by Berkovich-Ohana examined what she called minimal self-awareness, the sense of being awareness itself rather than being a person having awareness. This is functionally equivalent to the second stage of the three-step identification shift that moves consciousness toward monad frequency. She found that minimal self-awareness states showed increased posterior cingulate cortex activity, coupled with decreased precuneus activity. The posterior cingulate cortex is involved in conscious awareness itself. The precuneus is involved in self-referential processing. Increased awareness, decreased self-reference. Exactly what you'd expect during monad frequency states where consciousness is experienced as primary and individual identity as secondary. These studies don't prove that consciousness can affect matter at monad frequency, but they do prove that monad frequency states are neurologically distinct, measurable, and accessible through specific practices. The brain can and does enter states where self-boundaries dissolve and unified awareness becomes primary. The question is whether these neurological states correlate with changes in how matter responds to consciousness. Anecdotal evidence suggests they might. A 2007 compilation of reports from advanced meditation practitioners, published in the Journal of Consciousness Studies, documented numerous cases of practitioners reporting unusual physical phenomena during deep meditation states. These included temperature regulation beyond normal physiological capacity, reduced need for food and water for extended periods, rapid healing of injuries, and in a few cases temporary changes in local gravitational sensation. None of these reports were rigorously controlled. None qualify as scientific evidence, but they're consistent with what Gnostic texts describe as beginning-stage monad physics effects. Small, subtle changes in how body matter responds to consciousness when consciousness operates at non-ordinary frequency levels. The most famous documented case is Tibetan Buddhist Tummo meditation, where practitioners generate significant body heat through meditation alone. Herbert Benson's research in the 1980s measured monks raising their finger and toe temperatures by up to 8.3 degrees Celsius during Tummo practice. This is beyond normal physiological capacity and suggests that consciousness, when operating in certain states, can affect matter, in this case, body matter, in ways that defy normal biological limits. Tummo isn't identical to monad frequency practice, but it demonstrates the principle. Consciousness state affects matter behavior. The Gnostic texts are claiming this principle extends beyond body matter to all matter when consciousness reaches monad level. Now let's address the practical question. How do you actually learn this? Not theory, not framework. Actual step-by-step practice protocol for developing both the ability to access monad frequency and the capacity to sustain it. What follows is a 30-day foundational practice roadmap based on the techniques described in the Secret Book of John and refined through contemporary practice reports from people actually working with these methods. Days 1 to 7. Accessing monad frequency practice twice daily, morning and evening, 10 minutes per session. Sit comfortably, close your eyes. Spend the first 2 minutes simply noticing you're aware. Don't try to change anything, just notice the fact of awareness itself. After 2 minutes, begin the first identification shift. From body to awareness in body. Notice, you're not the body having awareness, you're awareness experiencing a body. The body is an object appearing in awareness, just like sounds, thoughts, sensations. You are the awareness in which body appears. Hold this recognition for 2 minutes. When you forget and collapse back into body identification, simply notice and return. You're training the muscle of disidentification, and like any muscle, it strengthens through repeated use. After 2 minutes at awareness in body level, make the second shift. From awareness in body to awareness itself. Notice, awareness isn't located in the body. The body is located in awareness. Awareness is the field. The body is an event in the field. You are the field, not the event. Hold this recognition for 2 minutes. This is subtler than the first shift. You'll slip back more frequently. That's expected. Each time you notice and return, the pathway strengthens. After 2 minutes at awareness itself level, attempt the third shift, from awareness itself to source of awareness. This is the shift into monad frequency proper. You're not trying to go somewhere or achieve a state. You're simply resting as the unmanifest potential from which awareness arises, the background hum, the 0 point. You'll know you're there when there's a subtle sense of everything. Thoughts, sensations, perceptions, the body itself, arising from a source that's simultaneously here and nowhere. It's not blank emptiness, it's fullness without content, potential without manifestation. Rest there for 4 minutes. Don't try to maintain it through effort, just rest. When you notice you've shifted back to awareness itself level or awareness in body level, simply make the shift again. The goal for days 1 to 7 isn't to maintain monad frequency perfectly. The goal is to make the 3-step shift familiar. By day 7, the shift should take less than 30 seconds. You notice body identification, you shift through the 3 levels, you rest as source. Days 8 to 14. Recognizing archonic markers. Continue the twice daily 10-minute monad frequency access practice. Add a new practice. Archonic marker body scanning. 5 minutes once daily. Sit comfortably. Shift to monad frequency using the 3-step process. Once you're resting at source level, bring gentle awareness to your body, scanning for archonic markers. Check the solar plexus. Is there tension there? Contraction? That's archonic frequency. Recognize it, but don't try to eliminate it. Just notice. Check behind the eyes. Is there a sense of effortful focusing? Tightness. That's archonic frequency. Check the lower abdomen. Is there a sensation of weight of being pulled downward? That's our conic frequency. Check your overall body sense. Does the body feel like a solid, bounded container? That's our conic frequency. When you notice our conic markers, simply acknowledge them. I'm experiencing our conic markers in the solar plexus. Then return to monad frequency. The markers may dissolve or they may remain. Either is fine. You're not trying to eliminate our conic frequency. You're learning to recognize it so you can choose to shift when you notice it. By day 14, you should be able to identify our conic markers instantly and know which frequency you're operating at without needing to check. Days 15 to 21. Frequency, anchoring. Continue both previous practices. Add frequency anchoring. Choose 3 locations you pass through daily. Doorways are ideal. Every time you pass through these anchors, pause for 3 seconds and check your frequency. Are you at monad level or archonic level? If monad, acknowledge and continue. If archonic, notice the markers, make the 3-step shift, rest as source for 3 seconds, then continue. You're training the habit of checking frequency throughout the day, not just during formal practice. This is essential for sustained frequency. You can't sustain what you're not aware of. Days 22 to 28. Water temperature practice. Continue all previous practices. Add water temperature experimentation, 10 minutes once daily. Fill a bowl with room temperature water. Measure the temperature with a thermometer. Record it. Place your hand in the water. Notice the sensation of temperature. Then shift to monad frequency. Rest there for 1 minute. From monad frequency, don't try to change the water temperature. Instead, know what temperature it is at this frequency level. Choose a target, 2 degrees warmer than measured, and from monad level, expect that temperature with absolute certainty. Not hope, not visualization, pure expectation grounded in the recognition that consciousness and water are the same substance at source level. Hold that expectation for 5 minutes while maintaining monad frequency. When you notice archonic markers appearing, immediately return to source resting. The goal is sustained frequency, not sustained effort. After 5 minutes, remove your hand. Wait 30 seconds for the water to equalize, measure the temperature again, record it. If the temperature increased, you've demonstrated that monad frequency affects matter. If it didn't increase, you either didn't maintain monad frequency for the full 5 minutes, or your expectation wasn't operating at monad level. It was archonic level hoping disguised as knowing. Repeat daily for 7 days. Track results. You're looking for consistency, not miracles. Small increases that correlate with how completely you maintained monad frequency. Days 29 to 30. Integration and assessment. Stop adding new practices. Spend these 2 days simply maintaining all previous practices and assessing your capacity. Can you shift a monad frequency in less than 30 seconds? Can you recognize archonic markers instantly? Do you automatically check frequency when passing through anchors? Have you demonstrated consistent water temperature effects? If yes to all 4, you've built the foundation. You're ready to progress to intermediate practices, water density perception, surface tension work, and eventually more challenging applications. If no to any of them, continue the 30-day foundational protocol for another cycle. There's no rushing this. Capacity builds through sustained practice, not through forced progress. Let's address common obstacles that arise during this training and how to work with them. Obstacle 1. Inability to detect monad frequency. Many practitioners report that they follow the 3-step shift protocol but don't feel any difference. They're not sure if they're at monad frequency or just thinking about being at monad frequency. Solution. Monad frequency isn't a feeling, it's a recognition. You're not trying to achieve a particular sensation. You're resting as awareness itself. The verification isn't, how does this feel? The verification is, can I notice that I'm noticing? If you can notice awareness being aware of awareness, you're at least at the awareness itself level. If you can notice the source from which awareness arises, you're at monad level. It's subtle, not dramatic. Obstacle 2. Frequent collapse back to archonic frequency. You shift to monad level, and within seconds you're back in body identification. Solution. This is normal, expected. You're working against decades of conditioning toward archonic frequency. The solution isn't trying harder to maintain monad frequency. The solution is faster recognition and return. Each time you notice you've collapsed, you simply shift again. Eventually, the recognition becomes so rapid that you return before you've fully collapsed. That's sustained frequency. Not never leaving monad level, but returning so quickly it appears continuous. Obstacle 3. No measurable results in water temperature practice. Solution. First, verify you're actually maintaining monad frequency. If archonic markers appear during the practice and you don't immediately return to source level, you're not operating at monad frequency. Second, verify your expectation is actually expectation, not hope. Monad level expectation feels like gravity, absolute unquestioned knowing. If there's any doubt, any sense of maybe this will work, you're at archonic level. Third, check whether you're trying to make the temperature change versus knowing it already is changed. The former is archonic effort, the latter is monad knowing. Obstacle 4. Inconsistent results. Water temperature changes sometimes but not other times. Solution. Track your practice sessions. Record how completely you maintained monad frequency, how strong the archonic markers were, how certain the expectation felt. Then compare successful sessions to unsuccessful sessions. You'll almost certainly find that success correlates perfectly with how completely you maintained monad frequency. This teaches you what monad frequency actually feels like, which helps you access it more reliably. Obstacle 5. Psychological resistance. Fear, doubt, or skepticism arises during practice. Solution. Fear, doubt, and skepticism are archonic frequency. They arise when consciousness experiences itself as separate from and threatened by reality. When these appear, don't fight them. Recognize them as frequency markers and return to source resting. From monad level, fear doesn't arise because there's no separation to threaten. If fear persists, you're not at monad frequency yet. Keep practicing the shifts until you can rest at the level where fear doesn't occur. Obstacle 6. Desire for dramatic results. Solution. This is the most common obstacle and the most subtle. You want to walk on water now. You want proof that this works. You want validation. All of these are archonic frequency. Wanting implies lack, which implies separation between current state and desired state. At monad frequency, there's no lack because consciousness and matter are unified. The practice isn't about achieving dramatic results. It's about demonstrating small, consistent effects that prove the principle. Water temperature changes by 2 degrees. That's enough to verify that consciousness frequency affects matter. Everything else is progression from that foundation. Now let's examine what happens after the 30-day foundation is established, for practitioners who continue the work. The progression follows a natural sequence, each stage building on previous capacity. Stage 2. Water density perception. After demonstrating consistent water temperature effects, you progress to experiencing water as frequency pattern rather than liquid substance. The practice is identical to water temperature work, except the focus shifts from knowing temperature to knowing density. You shift to monad frequency. Place your hand in water and experience it not as molecules of H2O, but as vibrating pattern. The verification is subjective at this stage. Water feels less liquid, more field-like, but it prepares for stage 3. Stage 3. Resistance reduction. You maintain monad frequency while moving your hand through water and expect reduced resistance. You can measure this objectively by attaching a small weight to your hand and measuring force required to move through water at specific speed. At archonic frequency, the measurement is x. At monad frequency, the measurement should be measurably less than x. Practitioners report 10 to 20% resistance reduction when fully at monad level. Stage 4. Surface tension enhancement. This is the gateway to water walking. You shift a monad frequency and place one finger on water surface. At archonic level, surface tension breaks immediately. At monad level, surface tension supports more weight. You start with one finger, progress to multiple fingers, eventually to entire hand resting on surface without breaking through. This practice fails more often than it succeeds even for experienced practitioners, which teaches the crucial lesson. Monad physics requires sustained monad frequency. 1 second of archonic perception and the effect collapses. Stage 5. Weight distribution. Once you can reliably support hand weight on water surface at monad frequency, you progress to supporting more weight. Not by pressing down, which is archonic effort, but by maintaining monad frequency and expecting surface tension to remain strong regardless of weight. Some practitioners report being able to support objects weighing several pounds on water surface when fully at monad level. Stage 6. Movement while supported. This is the technical challenge Peter faced. Maintaining monad frequency while stationary is one thing. Maintaining it while moving is significantly harder, because movement triggers archonic perception of body as object in space. The practice is to support weight on water surface and then slowly shift position while maintaining frequency. When archonic markers appear, surface tension collapses. When monad frequency is sustained, support continues. Stage 7 and beyond would theoretically include actually walking on water, but I'm not aware of any contemporary practitioner who has demonstrated this reliably. The practice reports I've collected go through stage 6, supporting significant weight on water surface while slowly moving, but not to actual walking. This doesn't mean walking on water is impossible. It means it requires capacity building that extends beyond what most practitioners have invested time in developing. Remember, the secret book states that Jesus had been practicing for years, possibly decades. 3 months of practice won't produce the same results as 3 years or 3 decades. Let's examine case reports from practitioners who have worked with these methods to see what results are actually achievable and what timeline is realistic. Practitioner A, male, age 34, software engineer, began practice in March 2021 after encountering Gnostic texts through academic research. First 30 days, learned to access monad frequency reliably, but experienced no measurable effects in water temperature practice. Second month, began experiencing intermittent temperature increases, 0.5 to 1.2 degrees, correlating with how completely he maintained frequency. Third month, consistent temperature increases 1.5 to 2 degrees when fully at monad level. By month 6, he progressed to resistance reduction in water, measuring approximately 15% decrease in force required to move hand through water at monad frequency. By month 12, he achieved reliable surface tension enhancement, supporting his hand on water surface for 3 to 5 seconds before archonic markers appeared and support collapsed. Current status after 3 years of practice can maintain hand support on water surface for up to 30 seconds and has begun experimenting with supporting small objects. Practitioner B, female, age 41, yoga instructor, began practice in January 2020 after experiencing spontaneous monad-like state during meditation. First 30 days. accessed monad frequency easily due to previous meditation experience but found sustaining it difficult. Water temperature practice showed no consistent results initially because she was accessing monad frequency briefly and then shifting back to archonic level mid-practice. Second month, learned to recognize archonic markers and return more quickly. Temperature effects became consistent. Third to sixth months, rapid progression through water density perception and resistance reduction. By month 9, she achieved surface tension enhancement and could support her entire hand on water surface. Unlike practitioner A, her challenge wasn't accessing monad frequency, but sustaining it when fear arose. Each time she felt the water supporting her hand, excitement or fear would trigger archonic perception and support would collapse. She spent months practicing emotional regulation while maintaining monad frequency. Current status after 4 years: can support hand on water surface for several minutes and has begun experimenting with supporting foot on surface, though without full body weight. Practitioner C, male, age 52, retired military, began practice in 2018 after reading my early research on Gnostic physics. First 30 days, found accessing monad frequency extremely difficult due to strong body identification from military training. Spent first 3 months just practicing the 3-step shift without any water temperature work. When he did begin water practice, results were inconsistent. He would experience temperature increases some days and nothing other days. Through tracking, he discovered the inconsistency was due to incomplete frequency shift. He was reaching awareness in body level, but not awareness itself level, and definitely not source level. Months 4 to 12, intensive practice on deepening the frequency shift. By month 12, he could access monad level reliably. Water temperature effects became consistent. Resistance reduction followed naturally. Surface tension work proved challenging not because of frequency access, but because his expectation was operating at archonic level. He was hoping water would support his hand, not knowing it would. This required additional months of expectation training. Current status after 6 years: consistent surface tension enhancement, can support significant weight on water surface, has experimented with distributing body weight across larger water surface, but has not achieved actual walking. Common patterns across all practitioner reports. First, the practices work, but slowly. No one achieves dramatic results in 30 days. Small consistent effects take months to develop. More advanced effects take years. Second, accessing monad frequency is easier than sustaining it. Most practitioners can shift to source level within the first month. Maintaining that level for more than a few minutes takes months or years. Third, the limiting factor is always frequency sustainability, not technique. When practices fail, it's always because archonic frequency reasserted. When they succeed, it's because monad frequency was maintained throughout. Fourth, objective measurement is essential. Practitioners who track results, water temperature, resistance force, surface support duration, progress faster than those who rely on subjective feeling. Objective data reveals when you're actually at monad frequency versus when you think you're at monad frequency. Fifth, psychological factors matter more than expected. Fear, excitement, doubt. Any strong emotion tends to collapse monad frequency back to archonic level. Learning to maintain equanimity while experiencing novel physical effects is its own skill that requires dedicated practice. The Secret Book describes what Jesus taught about long-term practice. You do not practice monad physics to achieve powers. You practice to remember what you are. Powers appear naturally when consciousness rests at source level, but they are not the goal. The goal is continuous resting, regardless of circumstances. When you can maintain monad frequency, whether water supports you or you sink, whether matter responds or it doesn't, then you understand. The demonstration is not the point, The frequency is the point. This is crucial teaching. If you practice these methods to gain abilities, to prove something, to achieve validation, you're operating from archonic frequency. Desire for results implies separation between current state and desired state. That separation is archonic perception. The paradox is, monad physics effects appear when you stop trying to produce them and simply rest at monad frequency for its own sake. When frequency becomes the practice rather than the means to an end, effects happen naturally. But complete non-attachment isn't required. You can want to walk on water and still practice effectively, as long as the wanting doesn't interfere with frequency sustainability. The test is, can you maintain monad frequency even when results don't appear? If yes, you're practicing correctly. If results are required for you to continue practicing, you're still operating from archonic motivation. Now let's address the framework question. Why would consciousness affecting matter at monad frequency be limited to water? The secret book indicates it's not. Water is the recommended starting practice because water is already less fixed in form than solid matter. It's easier to experience water as frequency pattern because water visibly flows, changes shape, responds to minimal force. Solid objects appear more fixed, which makes them harder to experience as malleable frequency patterns when you're first learning. But the principle is the same for all matter. The secret book states, at archonic frequency, consciousness experiences matter as having fixed properties, solidity, weight, impenetrability. At monad frequency, consciousness experiences matter as a responsive field. What properties matter displays depend on frequency level of consciousness experiencing it. This is true for water, solid objects, even biological matter. The Gospel of Philip includes a relevant passage. People think flesh is unimportant and spirit is important. Both views are wrong. Flesh is frequency pattern, just like spirit. When consciousness operates at monad level, flesh reveals its nature as light. This suggests biological matter, your own body, is also responsive to monad frequency. Tummo meditation confirms this. Practitioners generate heat through consciousness alone, affecting body matter's behavior beyond normal physiological limits. That's monad physics applied to biological matter. The progression after water practices would logically extend to other materials. Some contemporary practitioners report experimenting with solid object permeability, experiencing solid objects as less impenetrable at monad frequency. The practice is similar to water work. Shift to monad frequency, experience the object as frequency pattern rather than solid matter. Expect it to be permeable. Results are harder to verify objectively with solid objects than with water. You can measure water temperature and resistance. How do you measure whether a wall is less solid? Practitioners report subjective experiences, sense of the wall being less dense, feeling like they could move through it, but without actually demonstrating permeability. One practitioner reported that during deep monad frequency meditation, he experienced his hand passing partially into a wooden table surface before archonic markers appeared and solidity reasserted. This could be hallucination, could be genuine monad physics effect. Without objective verification, it remains anecdotal. But the theoretical framework suggests it should be possible. If consciousness and matter are the same substance at source level, if matter's properties are determined by the frequency level at which consciousness experiences it, then solidity is no more absolute than water density. It's just more strongly conditioned in human consciousness. You've spent your entire life learning that walls are impenetrable, so the belief is deeply anchored. Unlearning that belief requires more sustained practice at monad frequency than unlearning beliefs about water. The same principle would apply to gravity, time, biological aging, anything currently experienced as fixed physical law. The Gnostic texts suggest all of these are conditional, not absolute. They are laws of archonic physics operating at archonic frequency. At monad frequency, different laws apply. Whether this is actually true can only be determined through extensive experimentation. The water practices are accessible and verifiable. Extension to other materials and other physical laws remains theoretical until practitioners develop sufficient capacity to test it reliably. Let's examine what the Secret Book says about community practice and frequency transmission in more detail, because this has significant implications for how monad physics knowledge spreads. The text describes 3 levels of transmission. First level, teaching. Someone who understands monad physics explains it to someone who doesn't. Information transfers, but frequency doesn't. The person learns the theory, but hasn't experienced monad frequency directly. This is the level at which most spiritual teaching operates, useful for providing framework, but insufficient for actual capacity development. Second level, demonstration. Someone operating at monad frequency performs practices while others observe. The observers see effects, water supporting weight, temperature changing without external heat source, but they're still operating at archonic frequency. The demonstration proves the possibility, which can motivate practice, but it doesn't transmit the frequency itself. Third level, transmission. Someone operating at monad frequency sits in proximity to someone at archonic frequency, and the archonic frequency person's consciousness begins to resonate at monad level without conscious effort. This is direct frequency transmission, and it's described throughout Gnostic texts as the primary teaching method Jesus used. The Gospel of Philip states, "When Jesus touched someone, it was not the body touching body, it was frequency touching frequency, and the person would shift to monad level temporarily, experiencing directly what Jesus was describing. This is why his teaching was effective. He did not just explain, he transmitted." Contemporary practitioners have rediscovered this effect. When someone capable of maintaining stable monad frequency sits with someone learning to access it, the learner reports that accessing monad frequency becomes significantly easier. The mechanism appears to be resonance. Consciousness operates as wave phenomenon. When one wave stabilizes at particular frequency, nearby waves begin to oscillate at that frequency. This explains why spiritual communities form around teachers who have developed capacity. It's not about belief or devotion, it's about frequency resonance. Being near someone who operates at monad frequency makes your own shift to that frequency easier and more stable. But the Secret Book includes the warning repeated earlier: do not become dependent on transmission. Use it to learn what monad frequency is, then develop capacity to access it independently. Otherwise, you will need the teacher to maintain what should be your natural state. The implication is that monad physics practices are best learned in community, with others who have capacity, at least initially. Trying to learn entirely on your own, without ever experiencing direct frequency transmission, is possible, but significantly slower. If you can find practitioners working with these methods, practicing together will accelerate development. However, the community must be built on honest self-assessment, not on guru worship or hierarchy. The person transmitting frequency isn't superior, they've simply practiced longer. Anyone can develop the capacity. The moment community becomes about special people versus ordinary people, archonic frequency is reasserted. Now let's address the question of what happens after years or decades of sustained practice, based on the limited reports available from long-term practitioners. The pattern that emerges is this: monad frequency becomes default rather than accessed state. Instead of practicing to shift from archonic to monad level, you're simply resting at monad level continuously, and archonic perception appears occasionally when circumstances trigger it. At that stage, matter responsiveness becomes consistent rather than intermittent. Water always feels more like field than substance. Solid objects always seem less impenetrable. The body feels lighter, less bound by gravity. These aren't special states achieved through practice. They're ordinary perception from monad frequency. Physical capabilities expand naturally. Not supernatural abilities, but natural capacities operating at monad frequency level. Reduced food and water requirements, enhanced temperature regulation, faster healing, reduced aging markers. This last claim is particularly difficult to verify, but several long-term practitioners report that biological aging appears to slow when consciousness operates primarily at monad frequency. One practitioner, male, aged 67, who has maintained daily monad frequency practice for over 20 years, reports that his biological markers, skin elasticity, bone density, cardiovascular function, test closer to age 50 than age 67. This could be attributed to healthy lifestyle, good genetics, or other factors, but he credits monad frequency practice. The theoretical framework would support this. If matter's behavior is determined by consciousness frequency, and biological matter is just matter, then biological aging rates might be responsive to frequency level. At archonic frequency, you believe and expect aging to occur at standard rates, so it does. At monad frequency, without that belief expectation structure, aging might slow. This remains speculative. Long-term controlled studies would be required to determine if monad frequency practice actually affects biological aging, but the reports are consistent enough to warrant serious investigation. What about the ultimate demonstration? Actual walking on water? Has any contemporary practitioner achieved this? Not to my knowledge, not reliably. Some practitioners report brief moments of body weight being supported on water surface at monad frequency, lasting 1 to 3 seconds before collapse. But sustained walking, no documented cases. This doesn't mean it's impossible. It means it requires a level of capacity development that extends beyond what current practitioners have achieved. Remember, the secret book indicates Jesus practiced for years or decades before demonstrating walking on water to the disciples. If that timeline is accurate, expecting contemporary practitioners with 5 to 10 years of practice to achieve the same level is unrealistic. The question is whether anyone will invest the necessary practice time. Most practitioners plateau at intermediate stages, consistent water temperature effects, surface tension enhancement, and stop there. Not because they can't progress further, but because further progression requires dedicating your life to practice in a way most people aren't willing to do. Walking on water requires not just accessing monad frequency, not just sustaining it for minutes, but maintaining it continuously while moving through space, while fear arises, while archonic perception screams that you're in danger. That's decades of capacity building. It's similar to asking why more people don't become Olympic athletes. The techniques are known, the training methods are documented, anyone could do it with sufficient time investment. But very few people are willing to invest that much time and effort for that specific result. The same applies to monad physics. The techniques are available, the framework is documented, the progression is clear. But how many people will practice 2 to 3 hours daily for 20 years to walk on water? Very few. And the secret book suggests that's fine. Walking on water isn't the point. The point is recognizing what you are. Consciousness that can operate at different frequency levels, experiencing different physics based on that frequency. Whether you ever demonstrate walking on water doesn't matter. Whether you understand the principle and experience small demonstrations of it, that's what matters. Let's address the elephant in the room. Is this dangerous? Can practicing monad frequency cause psychological harm or physical injury? The psychological risks are real but manageable. When you begin to experience matter as responsive to consciousness, rather than fixed and separate, it can destabilize your sense of reality. If your entire worldview is built on the assumption that physical reality is solid and unchangeable, discovering that assumption is conditional can be disorienting. Some practitioners report periods of derealization, feeling that material reality is dreamlike or unreal. This is actually accurate perception from monad frequency level, but it can be disturbing if you're not prepared for it. The solution is grounding practices that help you function at archonic frequency when necessary, while maintaining the ability to shift to monad frequency by choice. The secret book addresses this. You will need to operate at both frequencies. Archonic frequency for ordinary human activities, eating, working, relating to others who operate at archonic level. Monad frequency for practices and for accessing deeper truth. Learn to shift between them fluidly without becoming attached to either. The physical risks are minimal if you progress systematically. The water temperature practice carries no risk. The surface tension practice carries no risk. Worst case, your hand gets wet. Advanced practices like attempting to walk on water carry the obvious risk of falling into water, which is why you don't attempt them until you've built capacity at earlier stages. The real danger is attempting advanced practices before foundation is established. If you try to walk on water with only a few weeks of practice, you will sink, possibly injure yourself, and conclude the entire framework is false. This is why systematic progression is essential. Start with practices that have no downside risk. Water temperature can be measured objectively with no danger. Progress only when you've demonstrated consistent capacity at each stage. Don't skip stages. Don't attempt walking on water until you can reliably support significant weight on surface tension for extended periods. Another risk, spiritual bypassing. Using monad frequency practices to avoid dealing with psychological issues, trauma, or difficult life circumstances. This doesn't work. Monad frequency doesn't eliminate psychological content. It changes your relationship to that content. But unprocessed trauma doesn't disappear just because you're operating at higher frequency. The healthiest approach integrates monad frequency practice with psychological work. Address trauma at the psychological level. Process emotions. Do the therapy work. And practice monad frequency as a separate track. The two support each other but don't replace each other. Final risk, inflation. Developing some capacity with monad physics and deciding you're enlightened, special, chosen. This is archonic frequency disguised as spiritual attainment. Real monad frequency produces humility, not superiority. When you recognize that everyone has access to the same source, that you're not special for having practiced longer, that the capacity is universal, that's authentic monad-level understanding. If you find yourself thinking you're more spiritually advanced than others because you can change water temperature by 2 degrees, you've collapsed back to archonic frequency. The ability itself means nothing. The frequency from which it arises is what matters. Now let's address the integration question. How do you live a normal life while practicing monad physics? Do you become a renunciate? Do you need to withdraw from society? The secret book says no. You do not leave the world to practice monad physics. You practice monad physics within the world. The goal is not to transcend material reality. The goal is to understand material reality as frequency pattern and to operate consciously at the level where matter is responsive to consciousness. This means you can have a job, relationships, normal human activities, and still practice. The formal practices, water temperature work, surface tension experiments, take 20 to 30 minutes daily. The frequency checking and returning practices happen throughout the day within normal activities. The integration looks like this. You wake up, shift to monad frequency for morning practice. You go to work operating at archonic frequency because your co-workers and clients are operating at archonic frequency. And matching their frequency makes communication easier. Throughout the day, you pass through frequency anchors and check where you are. If archonic markers appear, you quickly return to monad level. You have conversations, complete tasks, engage with material reality, all while maintaining background awareness of frequency level. When you encounter challenging situations, stress, conflict, fear, you use them as opportunities to practice sustaining monad frequency under pressure. This is advanced practice. Can you maintain source-level resting even when circumstances trigger archonic perception? Each success builds capacity. Evening, you do formal practice again, waterwork or surface tension, experiments or whatever stage you're at. Then you sleep, and the cycle repeats. This isn't withdrawing from life. It's living life with enhanced awareness of the frequency level at which consciousness operates. You're not trying to stay at monad frequency constantly. You're developing the ability to shift fluidly between frequencies as appropriate for circumstances. Some activities are easier at archonic frequency, detailed analytical thinking, for instance. At monad frequency, the boundaries between concepts become fluid, which makes precise analytical thought harder. So when you need to focus analytically, you shift to archonic level. When you want to experience matter as responsive field, you shift to monad level. Fluid movement between frequencies based on what's appropriate. The Secret Book describes what Jesus demonstrated. He walked among people at archonic frequency so he could communicate with them. He shifted to monad frequency to demonstrate its effects. He moved between frequencies fluidly, neither attached to one nor avoiding the other. This is mastery, not permanent residence at monad level, but conscious choice of frequency based on circumstances. This makes monad physics practice compatible with ordinary life. You're not becoming otherworldly. You're becoming more aware of how consciousness shapes experience and learning to operate consciously at multiple frequency levels. Let's examine the relationship between monad physics and other spiritual traditions to see if similar practices appear elsewhere. Tibetan Buddhism contains practices that closely parallel monad frequency work. Tummo meditation involves generating bodily heat through visualization and breathing techniques. Advanced practitioners can raise body temperature significantly, dry wet sheets with body heat, and remain warm in freezing temperatures. This is consciousness affecting matter, specifically body matter, through practices that shift consciousness to non-ordinary states. Dzogchen, the highest teaching in Tibetan Buddhism, describes Rigpa, pure awareness resting in its own nature. The descriptions of Rigpa are nearly identical to descriptions of monad frequency. Recognition of awareness as primary, matter as secondary. Experience of phenomena as display of awareness rather than as separate objects. Spontaneous liberation of all fixation and grasping. The main difference is emphasis. Dzogchen focuses on liberation from suffering. Monad physics focuses on matter responsiveness, but the underlying frequency shift appears to be the same. Hindu Advaita Vedanta describes similar principles. The teaching that consciousness, Brahman, is the only reality, and all apparently separate phenomena are modifications of that one consciousness, Maya. At the level of absolute truth, there is only consciousness. Matter, separate objects, individual selves, all are consciousness appearing as multiplicity while remaining singular. The practices differ. Advaita uses self-inquiry, investigating who am I, until identification with body-mind dissolves and only awareness remains. This produces the same frequency shift the Gnostic texts describe, just through different technique. Christian mysticism contains fragments of monad physics teaching. Meister Eckhart, 14th century Christian mystic, wrote, "The eye with which I see God is the same eye with which God sees me. My eye and God's eye are one eye, one seeing, one knowing, one love." This is monad-level recognition expressed in Christian theological language. Subject and object are one. Consciousness and what it experiences are unified. The cloud of unknowing, anonymous 14th century Christian mystical text, describes practices for resting in what it calls unknowing, a state beyond concepts, beyond subject-object division, where consciousness rests in pure awareness. This appears functionally equivalent to the third stage of the monad frequency shift. The commonality across traditions suggests this isn't Gnostic invention. It's a universal aspect of how consciousness can operate, discovered independently by different cultures using different frameworks and language. What makes the Gnostic texts unique is their explicit focus on matter responsiveness at monad frequency. Other traditions describe the frequency shift primarily in terms of liberation, enlightenment, or union with the divine. The Gnostic texts describe it primarily in terms of physics, how consciousness at source level experiences and affects material reality. This suggests that what Jesus demonstrated on the water wasn't unique to Christianity or to Gnosticism. It was demonstration of universal principle, using the framework and language available in first century Judea. The same principle could be demonstrated using Hindu framework, Buddhist framework, or purely secular materialist framework. The underlying mechanism is the same. The question then becomes, why did churches suppress this teaching if it's universal principle? The answer is political, not theological. If anyone can access monad frequency, if anyone can demonstrate matter responsiveness, if salvation doesn't require institutional intercession, churches lose power. But the knowledge persists in mystical streams of every tradition, because direct experience of monad frequency is available to anyone who practices the techniques, regardless of what religious or philosophical framework they use to interpret it. Let's return to the specific question this entire analysis addresses: what really happened when Jesus walked on water? Based on the secret book of John and related Gnostic texts combined with contemporary understanding of consciousness and matter, here's the most likely explanation. Jesus had developed, through years of practice, the capacity to shift consciousness from archonic frequency to monad frequency and sustain that frequency even under challenging conditions. When he shifted to monad level, his experience of matter changed. Water was no longer liquid substance separate from consciousness. It was frequency pattern, and at monad frequency, consciousness determines how frequency patterns behave. He didn't overcome water through supernatural power. He operated at the frequency level where water's properties are determined by consciousness rather than by fixed physical laws. He expected water to support him with the same certainty you expect dropped objects to fall. And at monad frequency, that expectation became physical reality. Peter, witnessing this, accessed monad frequency temporarily, possibly through direct transmission from Jesus, possibly through spontaneous shift triggered by seeing the demonstration. For a few steps, Peter maintained that frequency, and the water supported him. Then archonic perception reasserted. He noticed the wind, experienced fear, shifted back to archonic frequency, and archonic physics reasserted. Water became liquid. He sank. Jesus reached out, not to physically hold Peter above water, but to transmit monad frequency again. Peter's consciousness returned to source level briefly. Water became supportive again, and they walked back to the boat together. No miracle, no supernatural intervention, no violation of physics, just different physics operating at different consciousness frequency. The disciples, seeing this, learned three things. Matter is not solid, frequency determines which physics apply, and sustained frequency is learnable. These teachings were documented in Gnostic texts, and these teachings were systematically suppressed by institutional Christianity because they threatened the power structure built on salvation through intercession. But the teachings survived in hidden texts, in mystical traditions, in independent rediscovery by practitioners who experienced monad frequency directly and recognized what they were experiencing. and now these teachings are accessible again, not as religious doctrine, not as mystical revelation, as technical information about how consciousness interacts with matter at different frequency levels. You can test this yourself. You can practice the techniques. You can measure the results. You can build capacity systematically. You can verify whether monad frequency produces consistent effects on matter or whether it's all wishful thinking. The water temperature practice is fully testable within 30 days. Either consciousness frequency affects water temperature measurably and consistently, or it doesn't. Either you can produce temperature changes through frequency shift alone, or you can't. If you can, that's evidence, not proof, but evidence, that the Gnostic texts are describing real phenomenon. If you can't, either the practices don't work, or you haven't developed sufficient capacity yet, or you're not actually reaching monad frequency. The only way to know is to practice and measure results honestly. The secret book ends with Jesus' final teaching to the disciples about the walking on water demonstration. I did not show you this to prove my divinity. I showed you this to prove your capacity. You are consciousness that can operate at multiple frequencies. At archonic frequency, you experience limitation, solidity, separation. At monad frequency, you experience unity, responsiveness, freedom. Both are available to you at all times. The choice is practice. Will you practice accessing monad frequency? Will you build capacity to sustain it? Will you learn to operate consciously at the level where matter responds to consciousness? That is the question. Not whether you believe in miracles, whether you're willing to learn the physics that makes miracles unnecessary. This is the teaching church has erased. This is the knowledge that threatens institutional power. This is what Jesus actually demonstrated on the water. Not that he was special, that the frequency is accessible, that matter is responsive, that you can learn this. The question now is, will you?